Killam is Head of Operations at Autonomy, a think tank focused on the future of work. Hello, Jack.
Hi, good evening.
Evening, sir. And Iain Mansfield, Director of Research at Policy Exchange and a former civil servant. Well, Iain, a 4-day week would be nice if those people have the same productivity. They work harder in the 4 days than doing it in the fifth. Is there anything wrong with it?
Well, I mean, we'd obviously all love to do that, but the question is who would be paying for it? And it would be everyone else. It would be all the other taxpayers up and down the country. You mentioned productivity, and unfortunately, although private sector productivity has now bounced back to above pre-pandemic levels, in the public sector it's still lagging 5% below. So the case for them to go down to a 4-day week when they're still less productive than before the pandemic is just not there.
So,
But maybe it would. Sorry, go ahead, Jack.
yeah, that's fine. So look, we've seen civil servants, we've seen in real terms pay cut between 12 and 26% since 2010. They also have really high staff turnover, so people leaving their jobs from civil service. And morale has been dropped really low in the latest data that's come through. So what they're doing, I think, civil servants is reacting to growing evidence. So this is actual what's happening around the world. That a shorter working week for no loss in pay. It's not just good for them as workers, but for the organisations and the business they work for too. So we've seen, for instance, as I've just heard, productivity can be driven up by making a shorter working week. We find that when workers are more rested, have time away from work, they perform in their jobs better. And if we look to the public sector, so I know some people are sceptical that as we just heard, that the improvements in productivity in the private sector can be transferred there. This isn't a matter of costs. This is a matter of costs, right? We're seeing savings. So South Cambridgeshire District Council, who's been trialling a 4-day week, the UK government has done a lot to try and stop them doing that. They just reported this week, they've saved £434,000 because they've not had to use agency workers. They've been able to fill jobs that were really, really difficult to fill before because they weren't as competitive. So you've got to have a much more holistic picture here, I think, than really just a narrow initial sort of focus on, sort of costs to productivity. I think about these broader effects, right? When actually we see productivity go up, other costs saved.
Can you not flick this, your argument, Jack, on its head and say that at the minute, if it is taking those workers 5 days to do what they could do in 4, then they can do a lot more in 5 days than they're currently doing?
Well, it doesn't add up like that, right? I mean, if you took that
Why
logic,
not?
we could all be working 24 hours a day for 7 days a week. There has to be a balance, right, between the work and life. And what we're seeing
There does have to be a balance, but if they are able, the productivity, the actual yield that they are producing now over 5 days, how does this equation change that if they can do it in 4 days, surely they can do more in the 5th day?
Well, no, so this isn't how it adds up. And this is why businesses around the world, not just in the UK, are moving towards shorter working weeks. This is why we're seeing pilots with the numerous businesses just this week as well. We released our own research. We were following up on around 60 companies who began trialing a 4-day working week in 2022. They saw that these benefits, to productivity were maintained. And I guess that equation you're coming to, right, of why can't we transfer to 5 days, is because that's the reason why they need to have that extra rest, the recovery, the break from work. We see the effects, right? So simply trying to then stretch and work more.
They get a break from work 2 days a week.
Pardon?
I think
They get a break from work 2 days a week, don't they?
But what we're finding I guess, in the situation is that a 3-day break from work actually makes people better at their jobs there. So what we're seeing is productivity and output improve in these organisations.
So if I could just come in here, I mean, this does sound like a lot of wishful thinking, really. I mean, we're saying these civil servants need a break, but we're talking about DEFRA civil servants. These are office-based workers, most of whom are working at home. Are we really saying that these people are working harder than nurses, teachers, long-distance lorry drivers, retail workers, and a host of other people up and down the country? I mean, you say that the private sector is doing this, but we're actually in many private sector companies, we're seeing the opposite. We saw a lot of private sector companies saying that everyone could work from home, but we're actually seeing that most of those companies are realizing it's not working. They're telling the people to come back into work, not every day.
That's a different issue. That's not the same thing.
But if we look at the civil service, we're finding that the civil service bosses are struggling really hard to get those civil servants back into the office 3 days a week, even though they've been told to. Does this really sound like a high performance, high productivity environment where they're going to do 5 days work in the case of 4? I mean, look, if a civil
With all due
servant
respect, that's not the same
chooses...
thing.
But
That's the remote working isn't a
but it's
4-day week.
but it's very, very connected. I mean, if a
They're
civil
different
servant,
policies.
but they're very, very connected. You can't take this away from overall performance and productivity. And if a civil servant wants to go for 4 days a week, then maybe they've got some parenting responsibilities or they just want a better work-life balance, well, that's fine. But then they can go down to 80% of the salary, just like everyone else. I mean, why should the taxpayer, this is the basic question, why should the taxpayer stump up for 5 days of pay for 4 days of work? And there's no
We're
good
not getting
answer
4
to
days
that.
of work. That's the point we're saying. As we're seeing, I mean, often we're really pushed to ask for the evidence. It's coming in from around the world, right? We're seeing it in these organisations in the UK. We're seeing it in South Cambridgeshire. So they commissioned independent research from the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at the University of Cambridge to track the performance of their key metrics, right? They found that 9 out of 16 of those were improved. They were doing better in their services after moving to a 4-day working week.
I would say that just shows how
cost savings.
Well, I mean, I think that just shows how poor the performance management was there before that. Because if they can do that in 4 days, they should have been doing 20% more in 5 days.
I mean,
This is what everyone else is expected to do across the economy. And why should these civil servants? I have a huge amount of time for my former colleagues. There are many hardworking. I'm sorry, it's not as exhausting to sit in a nice desk in Whitehall or sit in your home office as it is to go out and work on a construction site or to work in a busy hospital ward. It's simply not.
No one's saying it's exhausting. I mean, no one's saying that some of these other organisations shouldn't also trial a 4-day working week. Talk about construction as part of our work, as part of our consultancy service. We work with organisations shifting to a 4-day working week. We've worked with construction companies shifting to 4-day working weeks. So the idea of this is a particular, limited privilege just isn't true, right? So I don't think it's really helpful to set people up against each other in this respect.
Does going down to a 3-day week follow this logic?
Or even a 1-day week?
I think at the moment,
and does then after a 3-day week, if people are exhausted after a 3-day week, does going down to a 2-day week follow this logic?
I think we've got to remember as well that at one point we didn't actually have a full weekend at the start of the 20th century. At that point, there were many right-wing organisations coming out and arguing against the full weekend for workers having Saturdays off. This is ultimately the weekend as a 2-day weekend is a historical product. And it's about time we really actually put this up for debate and thought what works best for us. We're seeing more businesses, we're seeing more councils find that a 4-day week works best for them. So it seems odd for yep.
Sorry, Iain Mansfield. Is it? Does this not just come down to the data? And if the data is showing an increase in productivity, and if that data is consistent around different places in the world, does it actually matter if it doesn't feel right to you compared to the hard numbers, the hard yield and the hard bottom line?
So I'd say two things there. Firstly, the data is a lot less compelling than, it may work in the odd, very high morale, high performance company. But if this was genuinely the case, then we would see the private sector adopting this. If it was genuinely true that you could get higher performance on 4 days than 5, we would be seeing all of our major companies doing this sort of thing. And they're not, for the very simple reason that it doesn't usually work. The second one I would say is that we are at a time when councils are short of cash. We're seeing councils declaring bankruptcy. We're seeing very high level rates of taxation. And if councils can get a certain level of productivity on 4 days a week, they should be getting more productivity on 5 days a week rather than seeking to raise the council tax on their residents to give all their workers an extra day off.
I mean, South Cambridge has just saved £434,000 by moving to a shorter working week. So we're seeing councils saving money on this. We're seeing.
So what's the evidence for that? How much have they saved?
£434,000. These were roles. They saved this because these were roles where they were having to employ agency workers beforehand. So they were having to pay, and who often have to pay higher rates too, and they could pay for their own staff. So they've calculated through the research that's been done independently for them that they've saved £434,000 by making this shift. More broadly, it's interesting that actually there was no direct challenge to any of the evidence we've been putting up here. We've seen multiple reports, whether that's in the UK, New Zealand, Australia, the US, Portugal, Spain, Iceland, where the 4-day working week is working. It's working for business, it's working for the workers too. We see these benefits in well-being, we still see the benefits in productivity. The evidence is stacking up. And it's better to look at the evidence and not just a particular ideological opposition or a culture war about sort of civil servants. It just seems odd.
But the evidence isn't as strong as you're saying, because actually, when we look at this, the government isn't satisfied with this evidence. It's put it under what's called a best value legislation, and it's requiring it to submit much more detailed evidence on performance statistics very regularly. Because actually, sure, they got in some external consultants to say that, but we all know that whoever pays the
It's not
piper
external
calls the tune,
consultants.
and
It's not
those
external
consultants.
consultants. That
You said they got in some.
stupid public policy.
Well, it's still whoever you get in to pay these, you're very unlikely to find some findings which displeases the people who are paying you for this. And that's why the government has
I know
asked
you're
for
very
much more
familiar with
rigorous,
paid to
much
give
more
research
robust
to correct
evidence.
results.
Hold on now, one at a time. You finish.
Oh, no,
Ian.
no,
Go
but
ahead.
what you can do is that if you have certain targets, we all know this, you can game it so that you can hit those targets, but other things fell off. I mean, we saw that in the NHS,
which
where there were specific
specific
targets about.
statistics are not standing up for the 4-day week from our reports?
So I would say you just need to be monitoring it over a lot longer period rather than over a period of a few months.
Oh, great. Well, that's fine. Well, it's good to know you're back from these councils monitoring their 4-day week for a more extended period. We look forward to you agreeing with the data.
I'm not backing them going ahead.
So they shouldn't
If
keep
someone
doing
wants to do a trial. I think so. I would say that public sector organisations should not be taking gambles with taxpayers' money at this time. If a private sector company wants to do that, that's their money and their profits, and they will do it. There's no justification for taxpayer-funded organisations taking these type of high-stake gambles with the state of the current public finances.
But it
That's
isn't a
your money
gamble.
they're
We've
playing
seen the
with, and
evidence
that's
that it
my
works.
money they're playing with. We've seen very, very preliminary things, and we've got one group of academics saying it works. We need far more evidence, and it's not for the taxpayer to
Well,
be
great. Let's have some more
funding these
pilots
reckless
and
gambles.
find out.
Not funded by the taxpayer.
Well, it's not been funded. They haven't had to pay anything for it. The service levels have been maintained. They've saved for
So people say.
They're not paying for it.
So people say.
So academics are judging it like evidence.
And in this model, can I ask this, Jack? In this model, would workers have a choice that if they're essentially being paid a full-time salary for 4 days, should they have a choice to work the 5th day, for which they would get overtime, presumably?
At the specific company they work in. I mean, so it's an interesting question. I think most of the organisations we work with who shift to a 4-day working week, we think it's really important to keep that additional time away from a job if you want to actually see the benefits, right? This is what I'm trying to get at. You can't simply work 5 days at an increased productivity level. It's better if you want to get that increased productivity, you need that time away from work. So I think most of the organizations see the most success. People have that additional day away from it. But I think it's up to different. This is why we've been trying them for 4 days. This is why we put out this report of 61 companies, where 54 of those 61 companies 2 years later they're still working a 4-day working week because they see continued success, they see continued benefits. The 4-day week really looks like it's here to stay. I think what they see, and what was really interesting is staff in those organizations, they've been experimenting with different models. So I don't think we want to say that there's one size fits all. I think for the most part, we see most benefits when that time away and people don't take on additional labor or additional jobs. But, it's up to different organizations to see what fits and works for them.
Yeah. And how can you stop them? Because the person might just go and take on a temp job somewhere else, an agency job somewhere else, and take it on to earn a bit of cash. I mean, that's surely their right.
Yeah, that's fine, and that is what happens in those situations. But I think hopefully it would be great as well. Hopefully, organisations are paying people enough that they don't feel the need to. It's not something you can necessarily limit in these circumstances. But I think we found, the data that we had and the feedback from organisations we've worked with finds that actually that happens in really quite limited cases.
But surely,
most people value that time away.
Yeah, but I'm intrigued now. Hold on 1 second. Sorry, I'm intrigued now because if the argument is that these employees are more efficient because they get the rest, then why on earth would an employer want to stop that efficiency by allowing the employee to work the 5-day week? They've defeated the whole model if they're allowed to do that, are they not?
Well, no, sorry, I think usually, I don't think employees at that organisation usually would then allow people to come in and work an additional day. Often,
but should the model not forbid it? How can you argue that these employees are at their prime if they only work 4 days a week, and then argue that there should be flexibility for them to be less efficient by doing the 5th day?
No, so what I'm talking about there is the option. I think we're saying, can you legally stop someone having another job in that 5th day. I mean, that's a whole other sort of question. But I don't think we have.
Why wouldn't you? Well, how does but if you can't legally stop them,
that isn't how it's.
Yeah, of course, and it would be very difficult to legislate for that. So how does this model work?
Can I just give a scenario? Let's imagine we've got 2 hospitals, say one in Cambridgeshire and one in Lincolnshire, and they both decide to go down and put their nurses onto a 4-day week, but they still need a certain amount of cover for the wards. So each of those nurses hops across the county boundary and does the other day on double time under an agency arrangement in the other hospital. You're ending up having them still working 5 days and earning more money, and the taxpayer's out.
I think
There's no way to stop that kind of gaming.
I think we've gone quite far here from like the evidence we've actually been building up into sort of hypothetical examples of what's happening with 40 weeks in full hospitals in the public sector, which is quite a long way away from where we are, right? Well, what we're asking for is not, civil servants aren't even asking for a 4-day week here. They're asking for a significant reduction in working time at DEFRA. So I think it's important to remember, they're asking for a small amount of time off their working week. They've not said specifically a 4-day week in that demand. I think it's really important we actually stick to what is actually happening, what actually happens in these organisations, where we see benefits to work well-being, we see benefits to productivity, and we see actually most of those, in almost all of those cases, workers don't take on additional hours or additional jobs.
I found this really interesting tonight. I really have. So thank you, Iain Mansfield. Thanks for being with us tonight. Jack, thank you for being with us as well.